You're listening to Home Sweet Home with Russ, McClellan, and friends. And here's Russ.
Hey, welcome back to Home Sweet Home with Russ, McClellan. What are we talking about today in the land of COVID? Well, in the last segment, I talked about, kind of what it was like growing up in the Lake Chelan Valley in Manson as it related to agriculture, as it relates to real estate. Basically was saying, hey, look, there was a lot of farms. There was tourism, of course, but it was back when, my dad's crew, my dad passed away this year at 86. So his crew would be like, those darn 206ers. Now there's 206, 425, 360, 253. I mean, the area codes over there are immense. But back then everybody was on the coast. There was no Seattle. It was just you're a coastie or you're a 206er. Those are your options. And we'll tolerate you for about 90 days at the most. And then you might want to give us our town back, or you're going to understand what a blanket party looks like. And it's not in a good thing. My dad used to describe it as a blanket and a couple of guys with Louisville sluggers. So there was some intensity back then that, I guess the good news is nobody used too many weapons other than the basics, right? Like nowadays, it's a little bit crazy what people may or may not do. But the point I'm trying to make is they were tough people, hardworking people, mostly farmers. Mostly tourism was just tourism, right? And there were second and third generation farms. Well, let's, fast forward a little bit and think about what has happened in the last decade. And I bet if you look at history from about 2000 to 2008, we had an unprecedented run. There was some pretty amazing things that happened, good and bad, and ultimately bad. It ultimately ended up in the Great Recession. And on another show, I'm going to talk about kind of what that, I think next week I'll talk about what happened in that run, because a lot of millennials right now didn't experience that, right? A lot of people in the real estate business and real estate investing don't know really what the Great Recession was all about in 2008 because they were too young. So right now, what's happening right now? Well, it's kind of interesting. We still have the exact same supply constraints as we have always had. So let's take a look at them. One of them is topography, right? Topography is a big deal. We were cut by a glacier in the Lake Chelan Valley. So what does that mean? Well, we go from 1,100 feet elevation at the lake level to about 8,100 feet at the top of Stormy. All right, that's a big gain. We have, I think, the third deepest lake in North America, 55 miles long, crystal clear, right? But because of those slopes, topography limits the ability to build homes, limits the ability to have developments, which isn't all a bad thing. That kind of segues into Chelan County as a whole has approximately, of all of the ground in Chelan County, about 88% of that land is owned by the government in one form or another. So although I didn't, I did get a finance degree and didn't major in mathematics, but I think that leaves us about 12% that privately held land could be used hypothetically for development. So we start with 12%, and then we have the topography issue that I explained. That's two supply constraints. What are the other ones? Well, we have an infrastructure problem. What I mean by that is we have to have water, power, road access. We have to have it level enough, or at least can create something level enough where we can build a house without spending more money on the excavation and foundation than we would the rest of the house. Anything is possible if you have enough money, but for the most part, infrastructure becomes a problem. Think about this. To transfer water rights from one place to another, you have to have an incredibly insane amount of luck. There has to be a lot of things line up. And the last one I was involved with took 16 years of my career to transfer water rights from one place to another place. And without water rights, you're really stuck with a private well unless you have a city system, or like in the Manson area, it's a city equivalent system called the Lake Chelan Reclamation District. And that's true everywhere. So you either have a public water system of some kind, or you have private water rights, or you have an exempt well. All right. Well, when you start looking around at all these mountains of available land of that 12%, You take out the land that's too steep, you take out the land that we can't get water, power, and roads to. What are we down to? Let's call it, I don't know, we have to get a forensic accountant to tell us exactly, but let's call it 6% of the land is now not buildable, or not, we're just not, the capability is just not there. Another thing that you must think about in developing any size of a project at all, and remember, the basic equation, like I talked about in the first segment, is supply and demand. So I'm going to get to the demand in a minute. But the third major issue we have is zoning. You know, in the first segment, I talked about what my dad's crew was like, you know, the guys that grew up, the kind of founding fathers of the Wenatchee Valley, the Leavenworth area, Lake Chelan, and so on, Omak, basically all through north central Washington, were primarily farmers. Well, when the zoning changed, which started, I believe, in 1996, when the Growth Management Act was initially introduced, and then I think full compliance for Chelan County didn't come until 1999. Well, part of that was a real argument about whether that was even constitutional. I believe at the time the commissioners argued against that and said, hey, look, Olympia, you can't really tell us, farmers, independent-minded people, what to do. We're not inclined to get permission from you for anything. 20-year comp plan, I have to get it approved by you to do something. And just to give you an example, at that time, zoning in most of the area, in the non-incorporated areas of Chelan County, was general use. I joke around about what general use meant, but let's just say it was vague. Some people might say, well, if you had enough money and knew the right people, you got certain things done. I don't know if I buy that or not, but I do know it was pretty not specific. And that was kind of the complaint, right? There was dairy lands on the west side of the mountains that were just victims of urban sprawl, and the developers didn't care about water, you know, et cetera. So they just developed straight on till morning. And if you think about that, now we have a topography issue, we have infrastructure issue, we have a zoning issue, and 88% of the land approximately that we start with is owned by the county. You can see where all of a sudden we have a very, very low amount of supply of land that can be potentially developed that could offset the supply and demand curve. And what's happening with demand? And by the way, there's one more very big supply constraint. It's called government. I don't mean to be critical, but I'm telling you, it's not efficient. It's not the people's fault that work at the government. That's not what I'm saying. But the system of, for example, building and planning applications. You might want to check and see if you have a piece of property that could be short platted, which is like 4 lots or less. So if you own 1 lot and you want to turn it into 4 or less, like 2 lots, that's called a 2-lot short plat. You might want to call the county and see how long that might take, and it might just surprise you. All right, if you had a 10-acre piece and you own a 2.5s, and everything was good, everything was in alignment, you had everything that you needed, and just find out how long it takes. It's crazy. So it's not the people that work at the government, but the actual processing of these applications, especially when there's so many of them and so few people. You ever heard the expression overworked and underpaid? Well, I can appreciate that with a lot of government in that world of government, because there are great people trying to process in today's world an incredible amount of applications. And what's sad is that nothing is conforming because of what I talked about before, where you don't have the right zoning, you don't have certain infrastructure, you don't have the right topography. So we're trying to use variances, and we're trying to use conditional use permits or planned unit developments. And all of these applications are very complicated, and it should be, in a way, right? Because we don't want urban sprawl. We don't want what we love so much to be destroyed by development. So therein lies this crazy dichotomy that we sit in. We don't like home prices going up. We're just upset, like as upset as you can get if you've been second or third generation, because you're being taxed to the point of property taxes. And not even counting sales tax and all the other taxes. I think we still have the highest sales tax in the country. But just real estate property taxes are based on your assessed value. And so for people that don't understand how that works, is the county assessor will basically, for lack of a better word, assess or appraise is another word. It's not quite accurate, but assess your property a certain value. And then there's a tax rate, and that tax rate multiplied by your assessed value equals how much tax you have to pay. Well, therefore, it's a double-edged sword. The more valuable your real estate becomes, the more real estate tax you're going to pay. Okay, well, that sounds great, but what if you're a second generation person that's owned something, or third? And now, let's say you're making 50 grand a year, 60 grand a year, like a normal human around here. All of a sudden, your taxes go in just 2 generations. They go from maybe 2,000 a year to 28,000 a year. It's crazy. So now all of a sudden you got to sell. So it's double-edged sword, right? And that's where we sit as we speak. The demand is increasing at an increasing rate. There's no supply to offset that demand, and now we're 75% down in inventory from 1 year ago. 75% down. All right, so hope you're finding this interesting. I find it kind of interesting because I've been doing it for 30 years, but man, I don't know the answers, but I'll attempt to tell you my opinion for what it's worth in the next segment. Thanks for tuning in to the Home Sweet Home with Russ McClellan. And today I'm solo, I have no friends. So tune in one more time for the third segment in just a few seconds.
Home sweet home, oh home sweet home, home sweet home.